Very well. This is a new one.
What do you do here?
I still have the other.
How much is it bring there?
I don't even want to say.
Japanese?
Well, I think it was somebody.
Next album. It's 50% bound.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, I'm going to turn the focus way.
How much is something like this? Really?
It's a lot. Here, look through. See? Hello to my friends.
1500?
No, keep it still. Hello to my friends from Washington, D.C. Don't laugh, you'll shake the camera. We're in the Washington Hilton, and from here we're going upstairs for many, many important lectures. We're here for a very important conference, which is also very important. Thank you, and we'll be back after this short intermission.
Manifestation of an ensemble of microscopic channels. We know that these channels are molecules, and I hope at the end today to introduce to you that these channels are strictly of big definition and not. And it is no coincidence that all this progress has occurred in 5 decades, the same 5 decades that Professor Bernie Katz has contributed to the field. He wrote a monograph on conduction in the 30s. He discovered ionic conductances with Hodgkin and Huxley in the 40s. He wrote the book, the whole book, on synaptic conductance in the 50s and 60s, and he discovered channels in the 70s. Great pleasure for me personally to introduce Professor Katz, who will speak for a few minutes and then chair the session. Is it possible to turn the light on the lectern?
Well, thank you, Scott. The reason I'm here addressing you is that Eisenberg very kindly invited me to take the chair of this meeting that we have organized, and I agreed with the provider that I didn't have to make a speech. I was therefore a little surprised when I saw on the circulated program that I was down for 15 minutes introduction with a title which I'd never heard of before, which I must say impressed me particularly because of its very original use of English grammar. This symposium is to deal with the development of our concepts of the mechanism underlying the nerve impulse. And indeed, during the last 50 years, there is very remarkable progress has been made on the subject after a period of comparative stagnation in the advantage of the nerve impulse. And it really started and was brought about by the entry of Alan Hodgkin into the field in about 1936. Now, 50 years ago, I still remember that some of the most eminent neurophysiologists were still highly suspicious of even the concept that the membrane potential was the important factor in bringing about excitation. In fact, that in some of the monographs, they still looked on this concept with considerable suspicion and didn't really believe it, although it had been foreshadowed, of course, for several decades. It goes back to people like Raman and Bernstein in the 19th century. Now, when Alan Hodgkin, as a student at Trinity College, started, his first work really was to provide definite evidence for Hermann's local circuit hypothesis, for the view that the nerve impulse propagates itself by its own local currents. And that was, of course, it was an idea which had been proposed by Hermann in the 1870s. It was a revolutionary concept then, but it was not until Hodgkin provided the definite evidence for it that it was taken universally accepted. And as an aside, I always feel that if I make sort of a slightly semi-philosophical remark, you know the philosophy of Karl Popper, according to which the scientific hypothesis can never be verified, but in his terms he says it can only be falsified. Now, I personally don't like the word falsification very much because in common usage it has a connotation of fraudulent manipulation. There are good words to use, namely, what he means is that it can only be disproved, or in German, Widerlegung rather than falsification, I think a better word. Nevertheless, we have here an example which I think rather shows that Popper's thesis, although it has strong statistical proofs, is really a philosophical exaggeration. I think the evidence for the correctness of what was a revolutionary hypothesis, namely Hermann's local searching theory, is so good that one wouldn't really advise any young man today to try to produce another unsuccessful falsification. I think we all agree that that is really true. Now, that was Hodgkin's first contribution, and then came the sodium theory, which is largely due to Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley and others. And this was, of course, a very important further step, showing that the action currents themselves can be expressed quantitatively in the transfer of specific ions, of sodium ions, that their flux rate can be measured, that the kinetics can be determined. And this was, of course, a very important step forward to express a phenomenon like a nerve impulse in terms of, in quantitative terms of ion fluxes through membranes. The evidence for that was not initially accepted by everybody, but very soon it was realized, it was so convincing that this also, I think, can be regarded as fully established now. Now, during the last 10 or 15 years, further progress has been made in trying to elucidate the physical-chemical mechanism underlying these ionic fluxes, and I mentioned only the important progress that has been made in discovering first gating currents, then in developing the patch clamp technique, which enables one now to visualize, to see the individual ionic channels in electroreceptive membranes as well as in chemoreceptive membranes, the work of Mayer and Sackman, which is now being used all over the world. And now the latest, and I think the very important progress which has now been going on during the last several years, and which I think will occupy a full generation of young scientists, is the successful marriage of gene technology, of molecular biology, with microelectrophysiology. Well, there's the example of the acetylcholine receptor, but there are now many cases where collaboration between laboratories, which may be very far apart and use quite different technical approaches, yet come together and are able to do things which will throw a very great deal of light on the key macromolecules in the cell membrane and in the cell itself, which are responsible for the maintenance of nervous function. Well, as you know, as you will have read, it is possible now not only to identify the key macromolecules, receptor molecules, but to take them apart, to produce site-directed mutations, to put them together again, and then hand them over to the physiologists who can insert them in biological or in artificial membranes and study their changed kinetics or their changed properties. This, to my mind, is the most exciting development, and this, I think, will, within a generation, tell us a very great deal more about the macromolecules, which are the keys to cellular and nervous function and to the maintenance of that function. Well, I think I've said enough. We've got a very full program. And may I now ask the first speaker, Dr. Robert Frank, to give us his talk on, which will be a historical introduction on ions through membranes, the first aspect.
chairing this meeting. I've been a fascinated student of electrophysiology since the beginning of my career, and have an enormous sense of debt to Hodgkin, Huxley, and Katz, who laid down the basis of the action potential and all that I've been doing for the last, well, we'll count the years. Hodgkin and Huxley produced a very elegant mathematical description of the sodium channel, and that forms the starting point for what I would like to talk about. And it's now a particularly exciting area because of the introduction of cloning and biochemical evidence into what was once solely the preserve of biophysicists. So I'll begin by giving a short translation of their scheme. Let's see, can I turn this on or? Right, okay. This is Hodgkin and Huxley translated into the sort of terms that I can understand. It is the description of what happens to the sodium current. First, these are a drawing of the experimental observations. If one begins at the resting potential and depolarizes, the channels begin to activate, and that corresponds to a transition from resting state to an activated state. And in the channel diagrams, one sees two gates on the channel, an activation gate, the M-cube gate, and an H gate, which is the inactivation gate. So during this activation, then the channels are progressing from several resting conformations to an activated conformation. And if one restores the potential to -60 very promptly, then this process is simply reversed, and one sees what might be called deactivation of the channel. If, on the other hand, you maintain the potential for quite a long time, then the channels first inactivate, and they remain in this state for as long as the potential is maintained at the polarized level. And finally, I've totally messed up this diagram because this, on restoring the potential, I meant to indicate that the activation gate closes, and for a transient refractory period, both of the channel gates are closed. Well, this is one way of thinking of the Hodgkin and Huxley scheme. The story then that I would like to proceed to tell has to do with, first of all, the consideration as to whether or not these two gates are completely independent of each other, as Hodgkin and Huxley thought that they were, or if a possibility first expressed, to my knowledge, by Rosalie Hoyt, that in some way that the two gates of the channel are coupled to each other. And coupling in the simplest sense would mean that the inactivation gate, for example, cannot close until the activation gate is open. So Rosalie Hoyt brought up that possibility, and over the course of the years, it has come to seem more probable that Rosalie Hoyt, in fact, was correct. And the story has several steps, which I will now go over in sequence. First, it turns out that if one perfuses a fiber internally with pronase, which is a very nonspecific mixture of proteolytic enzymes, it's possible to remove inactivation. So here we see a normal sodium channel activating and inactivating, and then after treatment with pronase internally for about 8 minutes, the activation process seems to be still there, which is in good agreement with Hodgkin and Huxley. There seem to be two entities, activation and inactivation, and one of them could be removed without bothering the other. And so the channel then simply stays open because its inactivation gate is gone. Well, it was not long before people discovered a number of substances that one could add to the axoplasm, which would restore some semblance of inactivation. And here are several of them are illustrated. differences is a local anesthetic. It doesn't look like a very good inactivator, but 9-aminoacridine is seems to be quite a nice one. And this dye, oddly enough, of the methylene blue family, which is a 3-ring structure, which in fact is fairly similar to 9-aminoacridine, also will restore a semblance of inactivation. So here we have the control trace where there is no inactivation. It has been removed by pronase, and now by adding this substance to the cytoplasm at a concentration of about 1/10 of a millimolar, one can restore a reasonable semblance of inactivation. Well, I'm looking at a trace like this, one is inclined to say, aha, well, the channel opens and then the dye enters, and that is what gives us this kinetic pattern. And that would lead you to think in terms of a model like Model 1. We have the activation gate and the channel. The activation gate opens, conducts for a time, and then after a period which depends upon the concentration of the artificial inactivator in the cytoplasm, it becomes plugged and no longer conducts. Well, detailed kinetic analysis of the traces that you saw in the preceding slide shows that that model, although in generally true, is not quite complicated enough to handle the entire story. So one has to progress to, well, any of a number of other possible models, one of which I have shown here. This is my favorite. And we now postulate that there are, in fact, 2 parts to the activation gate, which is shown here as a single part. This is not the inactivation gate. The inactivation gate in this experiment, or in this case, has been removed by pronase. So we're thinking in terms of 2 parts to the activation gate, and both parts, of course, have to be open in order for the channel to conduct. But the kinetics of the experiment that you saw before seem to fit best with the idea that there is a preceding state in which part 1 of the activation gate is open, but part 2 is still closed, in which the substance becomes susceptible, rather the channel becomes susceptible to block by an artificial inactivator. And it's also susceptible in the fully open condition. Well, this and other types of consideration were irresistible to a person like myself who thinks in very elementary terms. So the idea came along to try this out as a model for inactivation. And here then we see a channel with part 1 and part 2 of the activation gate. And then we have a particle that is like the artificial inactivators, but it differs in that it is actually tied to the inner surface of the channel and is a part of the channel, and it is clippable by pronase or by several other agents which break peptide bonds, so that in the pronase experiment we would imagine that we simply cut this off and leave the activation gate intact. Well, the closed conformation, in fact there are several closed conformations, and the transition to open requires progressing through these closed conformations to this that we might call pre-open state, although it is still closed in the sense that it doesn't conduct. And finally we come to the open state, in which both parts of the inactivation, or rather both parts of the activation gate are open. In both of these conformations, it is possible, the channel is susceptible to inactivation and the particle can move in as shown by the upper parts of the diagram. Now this is properly labeled as refractory. This is the state that would be occupied upon repolarization once the channel is inactivated. And this is the inactivated state where both parts of the activation gate are open. Well, this general diagram, I think, will fit virtually all of the data that is available, and it's available from several fronts, gating current studies, pharmacological studies, and single channel studies. And one of the pharmacological predictions that you might make is that if this is true, one would think, the inactivation particle will certainly compete with the inactivation simulators, and that turns out to be the case, as was shown by Ye and Narahashi, that if one puts in an artificial inactivation substance, that it indeed does seem to compete with the normal inactivation mechanism. Another stage in testing this scheme was to determine the rate constants for the transitions, and that was done by Bill Gilley and myself. This was, I'll leave names out as I promised, including our own. What we found was basically from study of gating currents and simultaneously fitting the gating currents and the macroscopic currents that we could imagine that there are a series of closed conformations, and that activation of the channel involves 4 fast steps, each of which requires the transfer of about 1 electronic charge across the membrane. So there are 4 fast steps and 1 electronic charge per step. And we're then to this pre-open state. The channel is still not conducting, but it is susceptible to an activation. There is then a relatively slow step, which involves what we reckon to be about 2 electronic charges. And the channel opens completely. And again, it is at this point susceptible to an activation. Because this has more charge associated with it, a consequence of that is that it is more voltage sensitive. So this is this step, which is quite slow compared to the preceding steps for small depolarizations, becomes more nearly equal at large depolarizations. Well, as I say, there is a lot of evidence for this. I'll simply tell you about a few of the experiments that fit, and one of them involves the fact that this last step in activation is more voltage sensitive than the preceding steps. And I'll go back on my rule. This is an experiment done by Bruce Bean. Bruce essentially counted the number of channels that inactivate after having fully activated, and in addition, he was able to count the number of channels that inactivated before they had, in fact, become conducting. And he found that for a small depolarization to the neighborhood of -40 or -30 millivolts, that although the bulk of the channels still fully opened before inactivating, that about 1/3 of them took this route, and that we can suppose is because this step for small depolarizations is quite slow, so they're inclined to go this way rather than this way. For higher voltages, on the other hand, he found that virtually all of the channels fully opened and followed this path, and the explanation is the one that I've just given. This step becomes very much faster as the voltage goes up, so all of the channels activate, and they spend relatively little time in this state, this pre-open state, and therefore there's relatively little opportunity for them to inactivate before they have fully opened. Well, that is one experiment. A clear problem with this type of model, in which one has a plug going into the channel when the gate is open, is that the channel might be expected to leak during recovery from inactivation. And one can get around that. That is, as the plug comes out, if we go to this confirmation, then there will be sodium current during the recovery from the refractory or inactivated state. We can get around that quite readily by this postulate of having two parts to the activation gate. We suppose that in the inactivated state, we begin here, and then on repolarizing, that the dominant traffic is to this state, which I've labeled refractory, and then on into the closed conformations, and therefore there is no reflux of channels through the open state, and that seems to conform to experiment. One cannot detect much in the way of sodium current during recovery from inactivation. Finally, single channels have the measuring single channels, as has been done by Corey Aldrich and Stevens and Horn and Vandenberg, give an advantage for testing this type of model because you know precisely where conducting single channel is, assuming that this general scheme is assuming that you have any scheme in which there's only one conducting state, then you know indeed that at the precise moment at which the channel enters the conducting state and the precise moment that it leaves it. One of the things that I've neglected to mention in the preceding slide is that the step in which the channel actually inactivates has very little charge movement associated with it, and we would therefore anticipate that this has very slight voltage dependence. So this rate constant, the rate constants for this transition should remain approximately the same regardless of the membrane voltage. Well, when the channel comes to the end of its lifetime, it goes either this way or this way, and by appropriately reckoning taking this into account, one can deduce that, in fact, the inactivating step does not involve significant charge movement, and that gives gives support to the idea that, in fact, inactivation of the channel involves a step that is closely akin to diffusion, that this particle just bumbles in and is not really driven in by the membrane voltage. Well, how does one put all of this together? Clearly, the object of all of this type of study was to get a sort of a picture of the machinery that's involved in activation and inactivation, and these give some kind of a schematic idea. But we also, no indication is given here as to how the activation gate works. Perhaps the most fascinating question: what makes these gates open and close, and why are they voltage sensitive? I was particularly inspired by the work many years ago of Henderson and Unwin, who found that the purple membrane protein consisted of 7 membrane-spanning helices, as shown here, and began brooding over the years on how this might, if that is this was the only structure known for membrane protein, how could this be translated into something that would give voltage dependence? And finally, that it seemed to me that the only possibility was something akin to this, in which we are looking here at the a proposed mechanism for making the conformation of the membrane protein voltage sensitive. And the idea is basically that there is one helix with a lot of negative charge on it and another helix with a lot of positive charge on it. And in the resting conformation, there is a negative charge exposed to the outer surface, and that these tend to shift relative to each other when the membrane is made positive inside, with the net result that we get a negative charge on the inside, and the negative charge at the outside disappears. So these two slip relative to each other, and the net result of this is approximately, it would be one electronic charge, equivalent to one electronic charge moved all the way through the membrane. Well, in order to explain the kinetics, one would have to have several of these. We thought that there were 4 fast steps, and here you can see that there are a number of subunits around the membrane, and these transitions then take place somewhere near the boundaries of these subunits, and they allow sequential alteration of the state, such that eventually, when all of the transitions have occurred, the gate swings back out of the way. Well, the day of reckoning turned out not to be very long off, and it came in the form of the sequencing of the sodium channel by Numa and his collaborators. And we now know the precise position for 3 sodium channels of every residue in the sodium channel. The sequences are really very interesting and very informative, and there are 2 facts that stand out immediately. One is that although it is a single peptide in all of the 3 cases, which are very similar, eel to rat of the essential features of all of the channels seem to be quite similar. Well, it is a single peptide, but it has 4 repeating units, almost as though one had taken 4 similar subunits and stitched them together. And within each of these domains, as they're called, 4 domains, there is a very striking characteristic, and that is that there are periodic arginines, which are about 4 angstroms apart, and these, as I say, are carefully conserved in all of the domains, and they're present both in eel and in the 2 rat sodium channels. Well, from that point on, one is left with a primary structure and a great desire to convert it into a tertiary structure, and there is no certainty in how to do that. This is the scheme proposed by Bob Guy